Back in the summer of 2012, I was working as a delivery driver for a small auto parts company in Texas. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I got to spend most of my time on the road. That summer was brutally hot, with temperatures hovering near triple digits every day. But I didn't mind. I liked the solitude of driving through the endless stretches of Texas highways. One Friday afternoon, my boss asked me to take a last-minute delivery to a mechanic shop in a tiny town called Red Creek. I'd never heard of it, but he handed me a printed map and assured me it was an easy drive. It was supposed to take about 2 hours, mostly down back roads. I left just before sunset, hoping to make it there and back before it got too late. The first hour was uneventful, just long stretches of dusty roads and endless fields. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the scenery began to change. The fields gave way to dense clusters of trees, and the road became narrower. The pavement cracked and uneven. That's when I saw the sign. It was an old wooden marker on the side of the road. Its paint faded and peeling. It read, Red Creek, 5 miles. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been there for decades, untouched by time. But I shrugged it off and kept driving. The further I went, the darker it got. My headlights barely cut through the thick canopy of trees overhead, and the road twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. It felt like I was driving in circles, but the map said I was on the right path. Then my radio cut out. 1 second, it was playing an old country tune. The next, it was nothing but static. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't pick up any stations. The silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires. That's when I saw her. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by my high beams. She was wearing a white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze, her long hair obscuring her face. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I shouted, rolling down my window. She didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless. I hesitated, debating whether to get out of the truck, but before I could decide, she turned and walked into the woods. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she was waiting for me to follow. Something told me I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cool night air prickling my skin. The beam of light barely penetrated the thick trees, but I could see her in the distance, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. "Miss, do you need help?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped and turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. It was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and unblinking. Then she vanished, disappearing into the shadows like she was never there. I stumbled back to my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, desperate to get back to the main road. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't find my way out. The road twisted and looped back on itself, the trees closing in tighter with every turn. And then I saw it. The same wooden sign I'd passed earlier, Red Creek, 5 miles. I slammed on the brakes, staring at the sign in disbelief. It was impossible. I hadn't turned around. I was sure of it. But there it was, standing crookedly in the same spot as before. That's when the static started. It came from the truck's radio, a low, crackling hum that seemed to fill the cab. I reached for the knob to turn it off, but the static grew louder, morphing into a faint, distorted voice. "Help me," it whispered. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. "Find me." The headlights flickered, and I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, just as she had before. But this time, her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. I threw the truck into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away. The woman didn't move, just stared as I sped down the road. Somehow, I found my way back to the main highway and didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station. When I told the clerk what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "You were headed to Red Creek?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He shook his head. "There's no town called Red Creek. Not anymore, at least. It burned down years ago. Some people say it's cursed, that if you try to go there, you'll never find your way out." I left without saying another word. I never told my boss what happened, and I never went back to that area again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers in the static on my radio, and I can't help but wonder if she's still out there. It happened 30 years ago in East Texas, a place where the pine trees stretch tall and secrets seem to linger just below the surface. My family was no stranger to strange occurrences, but what happened during that time still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. My dad, a gambler and a drifter, was always in and out of our lives. He worked odd jobs when he wasn't chasing the next hand of poker or betting on horse races. He'd disappear for months and show up out of nowhere, pockets full of cash, acting like no time had passed. One of those jobs, he claimed, was as a shuttle driver for a motel outside of town. But Dad being Dad, there was always more to the story. I don't just drive guests, he once told me with a smirk. I pick up people who need to disappear. Fugitives. People the law can't touch. I never knew how seriously to take his claims. My dad was the kind of guy who could turn a trip to the gas station into an epic tale of intrigue. But things took a darker turn when he vanished for good. Or so we thought. It started with my younger brother, Rob, who worked at a burger joint off the highway. One night, two men in dark suits walked into the restaurant and asked for him by name. They were polite at first, asking if he'd seen our dad recently. Rob hadn't, which was true. They thanked him and left. The next night, the same men returned, but this time, they weren't so polite. They flashed badges, fake ones, we'd later learn, and accused Rob of lying. They demanded to know where our dad was, and when Rob insisted he didn't know, they left him shaken and paranoid. Then the break-in happened. Rob's apartment was ransacked while he was at work. The door wasn't forced open, but when his roommate came home, they found the place turned upside down. Nothing valuable was stolen, just a few strange items. A tattered address book, a photograph of Rob's son, and a small stuffed bear Rob had recently bought for the boy. We were terrified. My mom and I hadn't been bothered by these men, but it was clear they were targeting Rob for a reason. We decided to file a police report, but before we did, something happened to me that made me realize this wasn't random. I worked nights at a radio station back then, spinning records for insomniacs and truckers on their long hauls. On my nights off, I often found myself wide awake with nowhere to go. So I drive aimlessly or visit friends who worked graveyard shifts. One night, after visiting a friend at a cable company, I pulled out of the parking lot and noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I drove, the car stayed close, too close. It was tailgating me, its high beams glaring in my rearview mirror. I changed lanes. So did the car. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass. They didn't. The fear set in fast. My heart raced as I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose them in a neighborhood maze. The car followed, its headlights glaring and unrelenting. I turned again, zigzagging through streets I barely recognized. But no matter where I went, they stayed right on my bumper. When I finally couldn't take it anymore, I sped into the parking lot of a 7-Eleven and jumped out, running inside to the clerk. "Someone's following me," I said, breathless. The car didn't stop. It cut through the parking lot, its headlights flashing at me briefly before it disappeared into the night. For the first time, I got a good look at it. An old tan sedan, nondescript but sinister in its persistence. Shaken, I stayed with the clerk for a while before heading home. I thought I'd lost them, but as I turned onto my street, my blood ran cold. The same car was parked outside my apartment. As I drove past, they pulled out, flashing their high beams at me before speeding off. The next morning, we reported everything to the police. A detective took our case seriously, though he didn't have much to go on. A few days later, he called us with answers we didn't want to hear. My dad, it turned out, wasn't just working odd jobs. He was working for dangerous people. He owed them over $50,000 in gambling debts and had skipped town to hide. The detective explained that the men harassing us weren't law enforcement. They were bounty hunters, working for people who didn't play by the rules. They'd taken the address book and the photo to intimidate Rob, hoping it would lead them to our dad. When we asked why they hadn't targeted me or my mom, the detective explained that Dad had listed Rob as a reference on a job application. It was a simple paper trail that led them straight to him. Eventually, my dad resurfaced, acting as if nothing had happened. He never explained how he paid off the debt or why he dragged us into his mess. But even now, decades later, I can't drive alone at night without checking my mirrors, watching for a pair of headlights that never seem to blink. Because once, I learned what it felt like to be hunted. And I know those shadows in the rear view never really leave. In the summer of 2012, I was living in a small Texas town near the piney woods, surrounded by thick forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. Growing up there, you'd hear plenty of strange stories about the woods, ghost lights, missing hikers, and shadowy figures. But most of us just shrugged them off as campfire tales. That summer, I learned that not all of them were just stories. It started when my dog, Daisy, slipped out of the yard one evening and bolted into the woods. Daisy was a loyal Labrador, but when she caught the scent of something, she couldn't help herself. I grabbed a flashlight and went after her, following the sound of her barks as they faded deeper into the trees. At first, I wasn't worried. I knew those woods well, having spent countless summers exploring their trails and clearings. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched longer, an uneasy silence settled over the forest. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, seemed to vanish. I called Daisy's name, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. That's when I heard it. A baby crying. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. But as I moved closer, it grew louder and more distinct. A high, wailing cry that sent chills down my spine. My first thought was that someone had abandoned a baby in the woods, which made no sense but was the only explanation I could think of. I quickened my pace, shining my flashlight toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. I froze, listening for any sign of movement, but the silence was absolute. Just as I was about to call out again, the crying started up, this time from a different direction, farther away. My stomach twisted in confusion. How could the sound have moved so quickly? I turned and headed toward the new source of the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The crying sounded wrong. It was high-pitched and uneven, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and scared, but the unease settled deeper in my chest. After several minutes of chasing the sound through the trees, I stumbled into a small clearing. The crying had stopped again, leaving the air heavy and still. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating a circle of grass littered with strange objects, scraps of cloth, melted candles, and what looked like small animal bones. My breath hitched as I knelt to examine one of the candles. It was still warm to the touch, as if it had just been extinguished. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the sudden, overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. I swung my flashlight toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it. Perched high on a branch was a figure, crouched unnaturally like a predator about to pounce. At first, I thought it was a bird, a massive one, but as my light caught its form, I realized it was something far stranger. It was humanoid, with long, matted feathers or fur hanging from its limbs like tattered robes. Its face was a grotesque combination of human and avian features, with sunken eyes that gleamed faintly in the moonlight and a hooked, beak-like nose. Before I could react, it moved, fast and silent, leaping to another branch with an eerie, fluid motion. The branch it had been perched on barely swayed, as if it weighed nothing at all. My instincts kicked in, and I ran. I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my arms and legs as I sprinted back the way I'd come. Behind me, I could hear it moving, its heavy, labored breathing growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, it would be the last thing I saw. Somehow, I broke through the tree line and into the open field near my house. My truck was parked at the edge of the property, and I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. For a moment, I sat there, panting and clutching the steering wheel, waiting for it to burst out of the woods. But nothing happened. The next morning, Daisy came trotting back to the yard as if nothing had happened. She was dirty but unharmed, and I hugged her tightly, relief washing over me. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, afraid they'd think I was crazy. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The candles, the crying, and the figure in the trees. Later, a friend of mine, who was deeply rooted in Hispanic folklore, told me about La Lechuza, a witch who could transform into an owl to lure people into the woods. They said she mimicked the cries of a baby to trick her victims, drawing them deeper into her territory before striking. I don't know if what I saw was La Lechuza or something else entirely. All I know is that I haven't set foot in those woods since. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I sometimes think I hear faint crying in the distance. Back in 2008, I was working as a park ranger at a nature preserve in West Texas. It was a quiet job most of the time, patrolling hiking trails, answering tourist questions, and making sure nobody got themselves killed climbing where they shouldn't. The preserve was vast, covering miles of rugged canyons and desert terrain, and there were plenty of places where you could go hours without seeing another soul. One night, I was assigned to a late patrol shift. It wasn't my favorite part of the job. Wandering through the desert in the dark isn't exactly comforting, but I'd done it enough times to know the routine. The stars were bright, and the air was cool, the kind of night that made the isolation feel peaceful instead of eerie. About halfway through my patrol, I reached a spot known as Raven's Hollow, a narrow canyon with steep walls and a rocky path that twisted through the desert floor. It was a place where visitors often reported strange sights, dancing lights, ghostly figures, things they couldn't quite explain. Most of the rangers dismissed the stories as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations, but part of me wondered if there was something more to it. As I made my way into the canyon, I noticed something unusual. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to roll in, even though the sky was clear. The usual sounds of the desert, crickets, the rustling of small animals, were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were fireflies, glowing faintly in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized they were too large and too bright for that. The lights hovered in the air, shimmering like lanterns, but their colors shifted and pulsed, blue, green, and white, flickering in an almost hypnotic pattern. I radioed back to the station, but the signal was weak, and all I got was static. Frustrated, I decided to approach the lights. Maybe they were some kind of electrical phenomenon, or a prank by local kids. Either way, I needed to find out. As I got closer, the lights moved, drifting deeper into the canyon. They seemed to dance along the walls, casting strange, distorted shadows that didn't match their movements. My heart pounded as I followed, every step feeling heavier, like the ground was pulling me down. I finally reached a clearing where the lights had stopped, forming a rough circle in the air. They hovered above a jagged rock formation that jutted out of the canyon floor like an altar. The air was cold now, almost freezing, and the heavy silence pressed against my ears like a weight. Then I saw her. A woman stood on the rock, her figure barely visible in the glow of the lights. She was tall and thin, her long hair flowing in a way that didn't match the stillness of the air. She didn't look at me, didn't seem to acknowledge my presence at all. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, as if waiting for something or someone. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight toward her. The beam passed through her body like smoke, and my stomach dropped. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Ma'am," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. This time, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, as if they held the void of the night sky itself. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the lights pulsed brighter, their glow becoming blindingly intense. I shielded my eyes, feeling the temperature drop even further. When I opened my eyes again, the lights were gone, and so was she. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I sprinted back through the canyon, the rocks and shadows blurring together as I ran. When I finally made it to my truck, I locked the doors and sat there, trembling, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The next day, I tried to report what had happened, but my supervisor dismissed it as exhaustion or stress. A few of the older rangers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. That's when I started digging into the history of Raven's Hollow. I learned that the area had long been considered sacred by the indigenous people who once lived there. They spoke of the ghost lights, spirits that guided the lost or punished the trespassers. Some claimed the lights were guardians of an ancient burial ground, while others believed they were a warning to those who dared to disturb the canyon's secrets. I don't know what I saw that night, but I haven't set foot in Raven's Hollow since. And sometimes, when I look at the stars, I see faint, flickering lights that remind me of that night. And I wonder, were they trying to guide me out, or were they trying to keep me in? My Uncle Pete was a gruff, no-nonsense kind of guy. He worked in the oil fields outside of Midland, Texas, for most of his life, and he always had stories about strange things he'd seen out there. Growing up, I used to think he was just trying to scare me, but one story he told me when I was older stuck with me in a way I can't explain. It happened in the mid-90s, back when Pete was working long shifts at a remote drilling site. The job paid well but demanded a lot. 12-hour days, dangerous equipment, and miles of nothing but barren land. He didn't mind the isolation, though. He said the quiet helped him think. One night, after a grueling shift, Pete and his crew were driving back to their base camp. The dirt road they took was rough and uneven, winding through miles of scrubland and shallow ravines. They were about halfway back when their truck's headlights caught something up ahead, a shack. The shack wasn't supposed to be there. The land was privately owned by the oil company, and Pete knew every inch of it. But there it was, sitting crookedly on a patch of cleared dirt, like it had been there for years. "Pull over," Pete told the driver, a younger guy named Carlos. "Let's check it out." Carlos hesitated. "You sure? Looks pretty sketchy." Pete nodded. "Yeah, probably just some old hunting cabin, but we should make sure nobody's squatting out here." The crew muttered their agreement, and they piled out of the truck. Pete grabbed a flashlight and led the way, his boots crunching against the gravel. As they got closer, he noticed that the shack looked even older than it had from a distance. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in the middle. A faint, sour smell hung in the air, like something had died nearby. When Pete reached the door, he paused. "Hello?" he called out, his voice firm. "Anybody in there?" No answer. He pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly on rusted hinges. Inside, the shack was dark and empty, save for a single chair in the middle of the room. It was an old, high-backed chair with strange carvings etched into the wood, symbols Pete didn't recognize. Carlos stepped in behind him, shining his flashlight around. "Man, this place is giving me the creeps," he said. "Let's just go." But Pete wasn't ready to leave. Something about the chair drew him in, like it was daring him to sit down. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the wood, he felt a shock run through his arm, like static electricity. He jerked his hand back and stumbled. "What the hell?" he muttered. Carlos was already backing toward the door. "Dude, let's go. I don't like this." Pete was about to follow when he noticed something scratched into the floorboards beneath the chair. A word, written over and over in jagged letters, "Stay." His stomach twisted as a cold breeze swept through the shack, carrying with it that sour, rotting smell. The flashlight in Carlos's hand flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Then they heard it, a low, guttural voice, speaking words neither of them could understand. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, the floor, everywhere at once. "Run!" Pete shouted. They bolted from the shack, stumbling over each other in their panic. When they reached the truck, Carlos fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely start the engine. As they sped away, Pete glanced back and saw the door to the shack swinging open and shut, as if something was chasing them. When they got back to camp, they told their supervisor what had happened. He dismissed their story, saying it was probably just an old squatter's cabin and that they were letting their imaginations get the best of them. But Pete couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, he convinced a few guys from the crew to go back with him to check it out. When they arrived, the shack was gone. The patch of dirt where it had stood was empty, with no sign it had ever been there. P quit the oil fields a few months later. He never said why, but I think it had something to do with that night. He'd always been a practical man, not one to scare easily, but the look in his eyes when he told me this story said it all. I don't know what he saw out there, but I believe him, and I've always wondered, if they'd stayed just a little longer, what would have come through that door? In the summer of 2006, I was on a road trip from Austin to El Paso, driving a beat-up sedan with no air conditioning. It was a grueling journey, the kind of drive that makes you wish you'd sprung for a plane ticket. The sun baked the road, and my windshield was coated with a fine layer of dust that made the heat feel even more oppressive. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was somewhere in the desolate stretch between Odessa and Pecos. My phone had no signal, and the gas gauge hovered precariously close to empty. I didn't want to risk running out in the middle of nowhere, so I decided to pull over at the first place I found. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance that read Sandstone Motel. It sat alone on the side of the highway, its paint peeling and its parking lot empty except for a single pickup truck. It looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 1960s, but it was my only option. I parked in front of the office and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like mildew and old cigarettes. Behind the counter was an older woman with a pinched face and tired eyes. She didn't smile as I approached. "Room for the night?" I asked. She nodded and slid a clipboard across the counter without a word. I filled out the form, paid in cash, and she handed me a key attached to a plastic tag that read Room 6. The room was as shabby as I'd expected, dim lighting, faded wallpaper, and a TV that looked like it belonged in a museum. But the bed was clean enough, and I was too exhausted to care. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and collapsed onto the mattress. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, a soft shuffling noise that seemed to come from outside. I sat up, listening intently. The noise grew louder, like footsteps moving down the hallway. I glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole, expecting to see another guest or maybe the old woman from the front desk. But the hallway was empty. The only thing I could see was the flickering light above my door, casting long, jittery shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind or an animal outside. But as I turned back toward the bed, I froze. The TV was on. I hadn't turned it on, and the remote was still on the nightstand. The screen showed nothing but static, but I could have sworn I saw faint shapes moving within the fuzz, indistinct figures that seemed to shift and writhe. Then the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The air in the room grew heavy, and a chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, flinging it open and stepping into the hallway. The flickering light was still there, but the whispers followed me, growing louder as I stumbled toward the front office. When I reached the counter, the old woman was gone. The room was dark, and the stale smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. I slammed my hand on the bell, but no one came. Desperate, I turned and ran outside, jumping into my car and speeding out of the parking lot without looking back. I didn't care about the money I'd paid or the bag I'd left behind. I just needed to get away. It wasn't until I reached the next gas station that I finally stopped. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, my hands still shaking. "Rough night?" he asked. I told him about the motel, about the strange sounds, the static on the TV, the whispers. His expression darkened. "You mean the Sandstone Motel?" he asked. "That place burned down years ago." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" He nodded. "Yeah, there was a fire back in the 80s. Killed a bunch of people. They say it's haunted now, but no one's been there in decades." I didn't know what to say. The place I'd stayed in had been real. At least, it felt real. But when I thought about it, I couldn't remember seeing any other guests, any staff besides the old woman. Even the pickup truck in the lot seemed off, like it had been sitting there for years. I never went back to check, but sometimes when I'm driving at night, I think about that hallway, the flickering light, the whispers. And every so often, I hear static in my car radio that sounds just like the TV in room 6.